Good day. Before I start, I want to apologize for my lack of professionalism when it comes to recording this. I'm using some equipment. I bought a new microphone so I would sound better, and I've tried to fix the lights so you can see my face better. Maybe that helps. Right in my eyes. But I'm doing my best, so I apologize. I might have to stop the video from time to time to make sure that it's actually recording properly and things like that. So please bear with me. I'd also like to say just a couple of words about my qualifications for speaking here today. I'm currently a professor of politics. My talk today is the culmination of a career of about 40 years, working at universities in the United States and Europe. And I've written about 5 books and hundreds of articles on the subject connected with what I will talk about today. That may not mean a lot to you. One reader commented about one of my articles. He said that Baskerville is the world's preeminent academic, although with all due respect, that's not saying much these days. In any case, I would like to, for purposes of this talk, I want to emphasize one qualification in particular, and that is that I've spent most of my career studying radical political ideologies. And I think you will see why that is relevant to the subject today. I think in many ways our plight, both as men and fathers on the one hand, and our larger problems as Western society boils down to the influence of radical ideologies. I should also start by saying that I never preach to the converted. I will not recite the injustices to men or the horrors visited upon fathers in family courts. I've done that elsewhere, and so have many others. It is important that we be informed about what is going on by people who have the time to research it and interpret it properly. But beyond a point, dwelling on the unfairness of the world and attacking the bad people and dwelling on one's victimhood, this serves no constructive purpose. At some point, we have to start doing something about it, and that's what I will concentrate on here today. I think the Men's Fathers movement greatly underestimates its own power. I think we could be much more effective than we are. The main problem is that we often focus on our own grievances rather than the larger harm to society. I believe we must take the moral high ground. The key to overcoming our plight is to show the world that the destruction of men and masculinity is also destroying our entire civilization. It is rapidly eroding the freedom of everyone, and the rest of the world must be made to see that they have an important stake in helping us rectify these unjust and destructive policies. That is the topic of my new book, Who Lost America? On the face of it, it is a book about current American politics, not men's rights. The title and opening pages give no indication that it has anything to do with men's issues. But it analyzes the crisis of the last 4 years in the United States. This was a period when the extreme left, in alliance with financially powerful people, staged what amounts to a coup d'etat and seized control of the U.S. government, with other governments following. The book asks, why did this happen? Why was this allowed to happen? I examined various accounts written by various commentators, some very good, Tucker Carlson, Alex Jones, Douglas McGregor. These inform us in detail of what happened, and the best ones frame it in terms that emphasize the importance for our freedom and our civilization. But even the best accounts invariably end on a note of frustration and even despair, because they can't account for why it happened. Many accounts, less good accounts, provide pointless and repetitive detail about events and repeat these events over and over long after everyone knows them. And the events that I have in mind, just to list them briefly, I think most people know them, but the fact that so many crises have come together at one point is really the issue here. The engineered COVID epidemic, the mandatory and deadly vaccines, The riots following the death of George Floyd in summer 2020, led by Black Lives Matter and Antifa, open borders, economic stimulation and resulting inflation, censorship imposed by social media companies on their own customers under pressure from the federal government, politicization of the FBI, CIA, and other law enforcement and security agencies, rigged elections, mass arrests and serious civil liberties violations, sexualization and physical mutilation of children, measures to control and bankrupt farmers, and finally the war in Ukraine. And there may be others that you have that you could list, but you get the idea. Okay. A few explanations are offered for these policies. They are attributed to the machinations of powerful men and women. Some suggest we have fallen into a kind of mass psychosis. These various explanations are often dismissed as conspiracy theories. Now we know that many of the so-called conspiracy theories have turned out to be true. Yet even so, the machinations of rich and powerful people do not explain why they succeed. The larger point is that dwelling on the deeds of villains seldom provides any constructive remedy. My argument is that the current destruction of freedom in America is being engineered by the same government machinery that has long been oppressing parents and their children. The freedom of Americans is being curtailed by a government machinery that learned its methods and techniques largely by eliminating the freedom and constitutional rights of fathers, sometimes mothers, in the welfare and divorce system. This illustrates an old principle that we have been warned about but tried to ignore, and we ignore it to our cost, that injustice and tyranny cannot be confined to one sector of the population, and it cannot be quarantined from everyone else. Either it must be eradicated or it will expand and spread itself to engulf the entire society. This warning has been issued in many times, in many forms. It was the principle behind Abraham Lincoln's classic House Divided speech about slavery. The most famous recent formulation was by Martin Luther King, speaking of segregation. He said, quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," end quote. By allowing such a flagrant system of oppression to fester for years, Americans made the destruction of their own freedom inevitable. I can outline the reasons here only briefly, but further elaboration can be found in my book. It is important to remember that lamenting and bemoaning convinces no one and provides no relief. Deploring moral decline, loss of Judeo-Christian faith, breakdown of the family, erosion of civic virtue, these vague cliches may all be true, but they demonstrate nothing. Even less do they provide any remedy. We can only understand what is happening to us by demonstrating the precise lines of cause and effect. Only then will we see how to extricate ourselves from this fiasco. And some of these are quite concrete and tangible and easily demonstrated. I will prove my argument with 7 concrete examples, 7 critical techniques that were pioneered mostly against male parents, but that are now being used against everyone. Number 1, the uniparty. Number 2, news blackouts. Number 3, the deep state, the administrative state. Number 4, lawfare operations. Number 5, sexual accusations. Number 6, politicized children. And number 7, the forever wars. I'll take one at a time. Number 1, the uniparty. Many now complain that Democrats and Republicans collude to implement tyrannical policies that oppress and enslave ordinary Americans. This leaves no opposition to criticize government policy, limit government power, or hold government officials to account. Without opposition, government becomes unlimited and tyrannical, constitutional rights are ignored, and democracy dies. This is intensified during the last 4 years as the Biden administration is supported by Republicans in its most unjust, authoritarian, and reckless policies. But the uniparty did not begin only 4 years ago. In fact, its first major operation was the divorce and child custody industry, whose abuses it consistently refuses to acknowledge or investigate and adamantly refuses to reform. Democrats profess to uphold constitutional rights and civil liberties. Republicans loudly proclaim their support for the family. Yet both parties actively and willfully destroy precisely the values and institutions that they promise to the voters they will protect and preserve. This is especially striking in the role reversals of not only the Democratic and Republican parties, but the larger political classes of left and right. Leftist Democrats have become the plutocrats and militarists and even racists that they used to hate and attack. And conservative Republicans do not just tolerate the policies of radical feminism they claim to abhor, they actively promote radical feminists and give them prominent platforms in the media. Naomi Wolf is only the most obvious example, as Janice Fiamengo has pointed out, but there are others. I think I can take this off. I think I need this. Number 2, news blackouts. Complaints have also intensified that the media no longer do their jobs to hold government officials to account, and that on the contrary, they serve as propagandists for authoritarian and reckless policies. No meaningful debate has taken place in the public media over matters as serious as the origins of the COVID virus, the lockdown policies and so-called vaccines, open borders, civil liberties, violations, and lawfare operations, and the war in Ukraine. Excuse me. Yet fathers know that this is nothing new. For years, the liberal and conservative media have averted their eyes and held their tongues as the corrupt divorce and child custody machinery destroys families throughout the country and with it the society itself. In fact, the media of both parties actively support the destruction. This is where they learned how to ignore the abuses of power that today are occurring on a much larger scale against everyone. Number 3, the deep state. There is much talk and fear these days about the deep state. But if the deep state is defined as powerful people using impersonal bureaucracies to control and manipulate the private lives of millions of powerless but non-criminal people, then the original deep state is the welfare state. While people conveniently think of the deep state as the operations of law enforcement and security agencies, it was the welfare state that created the model, and its operations have been even more repressive for much longer. As the name suggests, the welfare state functions as a complete state within a state. It operates its own secret police, a plainclothes gendarmerie consisting of social workers armed with police powers, child protective services, domestic violence machinery, and child support enforcement. And the welfare state operates its own extensive archipelago of secret tribunals, the notorious family courts. It was from here that the practices spread to the larger judiciary and machinery of criminal justice and security, the FBI, CIA, Homeland Security, and beyond. Number 4, lawfare. Marshalling the courts as a political weapon to eliminate political opponents is a major modus operandi of the Biden junta. Political prosecutions to eliminate Donald Trump from the election and punish his supporters like Steve Bannon and the citizens who were at the Capitol on January 6th are widely and rightly condemned. Yet similar lawfare operations have long been standard operating procedure against ordinary Americans. The cutting edge and the most serious example of lawfare is the family courts. Family courts may not be the first or only practitioners of lawfare, but they are where the technique was systematized and refined. For years, lawfare has been used by feminists and family court judges to eliminate unwanted fathers. They did this so successfully for so long that it is hardly surprising that other courts are now borrowing the same methods to eliminate unwanted political opponents and unwanted citizens. Number 5, sexual accusations. Sexual accusations pioneered in the family courts likewise provide one of the main weapons. Trumped-up accusations of child abuse and domestic violence used in family court were expanded into sexual harassment, sexual assault, and rape, all constantly redefined to make it ever more easy to convict and punish the innocent. Lawfare expanded outward from the family court to the rest of society through the operations of Me Too, which learned its methods of sexual accusation from divorce court practitioners. Okay? They then applied it to political figures like U.S. Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh and celebrities like Bill Cosby and the Prince of York. This has culminated in the current lawfare against Trump and his officials and supporters. Number 6, abusing and politicizing children. Politicizing and sexualizing children, and even physically mutilating them, has become a central part of the mainstream leftist agenda, supported by the Biden administration. Parents have experienced widespread erosion and violation of their parental rights, and those who try to protect their children are designated as domestic terrorists and targeted for criminal punishments. This too has engendered widespread condemnation. But this too is not new. The politicization of children was pioneered by the welfare system and the family courts. As any parent knows who has experienced these institutions, social workers and family court judges see parents as their rivals and enemies, starting with fathers, and they never hesitate to curtail their rights without any due process of law or any finding that the parents have done anything legally wrong. Often they don't even pretend that the parents have committed any legal transgression before permanently separating them from their children and even imposing other penalties on the parents. Number 7, the forever wars. The Biden administration now seems determined to embroil the United States in as many overseas wars as possible: Ukraine, the Middle East, China, and Taiwan. Moreover, their warmongering is actively supported by the neoconservatives of the Republican Party. These wars are justified not for the security or other vital interests of the United States. Instead, they are rationalized to spread what is described as liberal democracy, but what is more accurately described as liberal left ideology. The cutting edge of this radicalization of U.S. foreign policy is sexual ideology, especially radical feminism. This is the same feminism that created and controls the welfare agencies and family courts. One of the first institutions to become radicalized and feminized was the military, and today it is one of the most feminized institutions in America. The American military long ago became a massive welfare state. That's right. Its generous benefits, intended for the families of servicemen, act as a magnet for single mothers, whom it also provides with salaries, not as real soldiers, but as clerks and especially as lawyers. The result is that the military no longer values or honors men who sacrifice life and limb for their country. On the contrary, men who serve their country overseas return home often to find that they have been divorced unilaterally and involuntarily in their absence. Their children have been confiscated from their care and custody, and they even face criminal charges for child support arrearages allegedly accrued while they were serving in uniform. What could more effectively undermine the morale that is vital for military strength, or could contribute to the recruitment crisis that the military is now experiencing? This feminization has had an impact on military effectiveness itself. Most obviously, it literally weakens the military to pretend that women can serve in combat units. But it does not stop there. As long ago as the Vietnam War, military operations themselves were being justified as a form of international social work, an international welfare state. The Johnson administration was implementing the same Great Society welfare policies in cities like Saigon with the same disastrous results that they had already rehearsed in American cities. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were justified for women's rights and supported even by supposedly pacifist women's groups like Code Pink. American foreign policy was strongly sexualized during the Obama administration, when women's rights and homosexuals' rights were explicitly designated as goals of U.S. foreign policy. Intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations and NATO, and these are strongly dominated by the United States, have also become bastions of radical feminism and expend far more time and resources to promote gender equality than they do to ensure collective security and preserve global peace for which they were supposedly created. Now, I have emphasized all through this the American context, because that is the epicenter of all this, and that is the subject of my book. But European governments have slavishly followed the Americans, both in imitating their example domestically and in supporting their reckless adventures abroad. Traditionally, the Europeans, and especially the British, served as loyal but critical advisors to the Americans and moderated unwise actions which they sometimes undertook. But now European governments resemble the old puppet governments of Eastern Europe, toadying to the Americans, as some of them used to toady to the Soviet Union. Why is this? Simple. Here too, the culprit is the welfare state. If you want to have an independent foreign policy, you must have a strong and independent military. Without a viable military, you cannot have your own foreign policy, and therefore your own sovereign state. European conservatives complain that their national sovereignties are undermined by the European Union through immigration. But their sovereignty is undermined just as much by NATO, which controls their foreign policy. The Europeans depend for their defense on the Americans, so when it comes to international affairs, the Americans call the shots. And why can't European countries maintain their own independent militaries? Because they prefer to spend the money on their comfy welfare states. This is more than an economic trade-off, and it reflects two sharply opposed understandings of government itself. A country with an army is a patriarchy, with strong men and women who respect them. A country with a welfare state is a matriarchy, with domineering women and weak men whom the women despise. The choice is ours. The point of all these examples is to show that the injustices and destruction wrought by the welfare divorce machinery cannot be confined, and it has not been confined, to parents and families. They were the rehearsals for larger, even more destructive policies that have now been unleashed against other Americans and also citizens of other countries. And these are only the most concrete and tangible examples. I could point out, for example, as I have in some articles in Chronicles magazine, that the riots incited by BLM and Antifa in the summer of 2020 were instigated largely by adolescents made fatherless by the family courts and the welfare system. I could point out that BLM, Black Lives Matter, is an organization founded and run not by black men, but by black feminists, and their manifesto proclaims their intent to further destroy black men and black families. In other words, I think that the racial tension in this country is largely a flanking maneuver for a sexual agenda, which is really what's important. I could point out, as Janice Fiamengo has done, that the same feminists were the most vociferous and aggressive in pushing for the COVID lockdowns that wrought such destruction in people's livelihoods and in the economy of the entire society. So, what can be done about all this? Well, the other striking thing about the best of today's commentators on our crisis is that they have no solution. They issue frustrated calls for Americans to wake up and oppose all this, which seldom works. They call on Europeans to resist their governments, but this too is unlikely. It's an ironic choice of words to call on Americans to wake up, considering that they identify the woke ideology as the source of the problem. Anyway, I think too many commentators place far too much faith in elections, hoping for a savior to ride in on a white horse following an election victory. I agree, in fact, that the coming U.S. election is certainly the most important in my lifetime. And the first one in my lifetime was in 1960. If Biden or someone like him wins, the result will accelerate the decline of the U.S. and the West. But if Trump wins, we will not be out of the woods by any means. So either way, more is needed. The only way out of this debacle is to break the power of radical ideology. This means we must break the power of radical feminism, which now stands undisputed at the forefront of the left and serves as its cutting edge. Okay. You might say this is easier said than done, but not necessarily. We have not really tried. For this, I turn to the greatest mind the men's movement has ever produced, Professor Daniel Amneas. Amneas was a brilliant Shakespeare scholar who also wrote powerful books on fatherhood. His greatest book was titled The Case for Father Custody. There, Professor Amneas outlined this key principle. The linchpin in the feminist program is mother custody following divorce. I'm quoting here. The linchpin in the feminist program is mother custody following divorce. Pull that pin and the feminist structure collapses. End quote. And I might add the rest of the radical sexual agenda collapses with it. I think the left today collapses with it. More than anything, it is mother custody of children that undermines masculinity and turns men into frightened, impotent sissies, at the same time that it turns their children into aggressive nihilists, rebelling against their fathers and everything else. Amneas continues, quote, "Until then, men must remain afraid of women, of marriage, and of feminism." End quote. He adds that they must also fear the divorce court judges, and I will add that they, and all of us, must fear all government officials who learned from the matriarchy how to create and enforce other bureaucratic tyrannies of the deep state, and who understand that ordinary men heading families poses the principal impediment to their power. In today's terms, the only possible solution is clear. We must once again make marriage a legally enforceable contract by abolishing the indefensible oxymoron of no-fault justice, and we must restore a presumption of father custody. Is this impossible? No, not at all. It is very feasible. It is feasible because men have an enormous source of leverage that is growing every day, but that they have never used. This leverage comes from the marriage strike, also known as men going their own way, or MGTOW. Helen Smith described this 10 years ago in her important book, Men on Strike, and since then it has only intensified. This is men refusing to marry and start families because they know how divorce courts can destroy every aspect of their lives. Now, by itself, the marriage strike cannot accomplish anything, and so far it has not even tried to accomplish anything. This is because it has no direction or purpose. The men's revolt is a genuinely spontaneous citizen action. In fact, that in itself is its strength. Men do it on their own, without any prompting or encouragement. But like any strike, it must be directed to a purpose. It must be used as leverage to accomplish a concrete goal. That goal is to reform the unjust, utterly indefensible, no-fault divorce laws and the crooked courts that administer them. The proof that this will work comes from the fury it has already unleashed from the political class. I describe all this in my book. In the last few years, politician after politician, pundit after pundit has queued up to scold and excoriate young men for their failure to marry and start families. They have become almost apoplectic with rage and invective. Ironically, this comes primarily not from the feminists, but especially from the conservative political class, and above all from evangelical pastors and other political activists. Ironically, these are the same people who have failed spectacularly to save the family that they claim to value from accelerated decline and destruction. These scolding tongues accuse men of puerility for refusing to put their head in the noose of feminist divorce law. But they can scold and bluster all they want. It is their own fault for ignoring these abuses year after year, and there is nothing else they can do about it. No clearer proof exists of a professional political class that hates and fears its own citizens than the vitriol it pours out against men who initiate their own measures to defend their own freedom. The conservative members of that class would rather go down to defeat than allow ordinary citizens to displace them from their exalted place as gatekeepers of opposition and political bosses over the rest of us. It is easy to see why the political class, especially the conservative political class, hates young men. Men acting on their own can succeed where the professional political class has failed. The implications are potentially sweeping and revolutionary and go far beyond men's issues. Striking male citizens are effectively declaring that the political class, not just the Republican Party, the obvious rhino Republicans or neoconservatives, but the entire entourage of professional hangers-on, right as well as left, is unnecessary, redundant, and even parasitic. By boycotting marriage and families, men acquire the leverage to demand critical political and legal changes and restore democratic government, without relying on politicians, judges, lawyers, lobbyists, lapdog journalists, parlor intellectuals, and the others who have usurped our citizenship and who mostly serve to stand in the way. Rather than mortgaging their citizenship to paid professionals, men can once again seize the initiative and become active citizens and the true leaders of society. And all the political class can do is fuss and fume and call them ugly names. This is why the men's strike has the potential to achieve far more than justice for fathers and children in the courts, even more than restoring marriage and families, though it will also do that. If properly directed, it will curtail the power of the deep state, the judicial oligarchy, and the entire political class that pretends to oppose the deep state and judicial oligarchy, but really is just an extension of them. Now, as long as the marriage strike is purely a matter of fear and self-preservation, so long as its purpose, so long as it lacks purpose, so long as it lasts indefinitely and open-endedly, without demanding concrete changes in government policy, then there is some truth in what the scolds say. Men should not forego, they should not have to forego, marriage and children and families. These are life's greatest joys, and the vast majority of men want to enjoy these blessings. Men should also not cower in fear of women and judges. In itself, it is indeed an unmanly stance. I do not advocate the marriage strike as a permanent life choice. Like any effective strike, it is a temporary measure, a means to an end. But young men have nothing to lose, because it takes what many young men are already doing spontaneously, and what inevitably they will continue to do, whether we like it or not, no matter how much we scold them, and it channels their boycott into constructive goals that serve the larger public good. This makes it not puerile, but manly. The other beauty of this is that it requires none of the things that we do not have. It requires no money, no new organizations begging for money, no paid professional leaders eager for the first opportunity to join the political class and betray the rest of us. It requires only a few politically articulate people like those at this conference, to publicize what the men are doing and issue the necessary demands. They do not even have to agree with one another 100% on precisely what those demands are, but they will need the bulk of young men to provide the leverage by their actions that will force the political class to listen. And by the way, I might add here that among the politically articulate people that we might invite to help give purpose to this strike, this boycott, are the religious clergy. Historically, that's an important role they served. I think they too have nothing to lose and everything to gain. But they must first forsake and repent of their shameful silence on this, and then serve as a voice for truly resuscitating the family, rather than their pointless gimmicks and worse that they use as the pretense for their silence and inaction. Now, some people ask me, what about the women who must suffer from not having men to marry? But women are already complaining that they do not have men to marry. Okay? If they want husbands and families, they must join with the men, support the men, and demand reform as well. Nothing will bring faster results than angry women pointing the finger, not at the men, but at the corrupt divorce industry. The women, too, have nothing to lose and everything to gain. The sooner it is successful, the sooner more men and women and children and societies can go back to having happy, healthy families without the threat and extortion of divorce hanging over their lives. I hope the importance of what I'm saying sinks in. You, the young men of America and other countries, have the potential to save not only yourselves, you are uniquely situated to save the entire civilization of the West. In fact, no one else can do it. You may feel helpless and impotent, but you are in a position to do what no one else can do. You and you alone can save our freedom and our civilization. And if you pass up this historical opportunity, you will deserve all the scorn and approbation that the feminists and scolds heap on you. And that is how history will judge you. Finally, you must rely on no one but yourselves. You cannot expect to be rescued from the railroad tracks by politicians, however well-spoken, by influencers, however mediagenic, or by women, however well-intentioned. You alone must rescue first yourselves and then everyone else. Your own willingness to act is itself a major part of your freedom. Salvation will not come from elections. It will not come from watching videos and clicking like and leaving endless comments with endless opinions about the unfairness of it all. It will come from action by you. So stop dreaming and act. But there is no reason not to act. You have nothing to lose. You can refrain from marriage and women and waste away in obscurity, or you can refuse to marry with defiance and show the world that you act in principle. The choice is yours. In closing, I want to again just emphasize very briefly my qualifications for saying this. I've spent almost 40 years of professional study of radical ideologies, the ideologies that I believe now grip our society in the West. As a professional scholar, I also have a pretty good appreciation for the difference between good ideas that can succeed and the pablum that comes from the parlor intellectuals. Daniel Amneas, whom I've quoted, and who is my inspiration for this, was an intellectual giant who left his life's work studying Shakespeare in order to devote himself to the crisis of men and fathers. He knew what he was talking about. And when I say that about him, I know what I'm talking about. If you think you know more than Amneas and I do, just keep in mind that there are 1 million young men who think they know more than you do. And each one thinks he knows more than all the others. The result is 1,000,001 opinions on social media and no action whatsoever. If you want to continue the paralysis, then keep watching videos and keep clicking like. If, on the other hand, you want to be free, then you must follow this course of action. Thank you.